Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our conversations, as we're calling it, Talks with Walt. That is to say, we are working through each of the poems of the deathbed edition of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We now turn to Song of Myself, passage 6, maybe one of the most important single passages in all of American literature. It certainly is going to be for us one of those classic texts of 303. We're going to reference it a lot in many discussions in 303. I just want to, though, pick up with where we left off when we finished that really controversial passage of number 5. Norton's anthology will say this about that experience of us working with specifically passage 5. I love the way that Norton says it this way: the debate, and we're going to sense this debate continuing in our discussion of 6. The debate between the soul and the body, a fixed convention of medieval literature, influenced later writers. Generally, the soul and the body were regarded as opposites and enemies, one good, one evil. But in this mystical union of body and soul expressed in erotic imagery, we obviously talked about that, the poet experiences immediate intuitive revelation. It's remarkable that the mystical state is achieved not by rejecting the physical senses, but by their joyous consummation with the spiritual. And then cross-referencing is for sections 21, line 1, section 48, lines 1 and 2, as we referenced as well. Now, there's often an attempt to divide Song of Myself up into sections, and if the first 5 sections is a group unto itself, then often scholars have pointed out that sections 6 through 19, lines 99 through 388, will serve as well as a unit of a kind, all right? Now, we're going to see Whitman's Pedagogy here. Now, this is a term I've used before, and we'll come to it in its full fruition when we get to passage 46 and 47. We'll make observation, however, here. What we mean by pedagogy is simply Whitman as teacher. Just to remind, Whitman and earlier lectures, we made these observations. My assumption is you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, find our Talks with Walt. My hope is that you've worked through all of the inscriptions, 24 poems, as well as starting from Paumanok sections 1 through 19. We're going to reference starting from Paumanok a number of times here in this discussion. And then, of course, our conversations with Song of Myself from the intro, obviously, to passage number 5. We're going to have a lot of echoes here. You'll remember we said we're looking at Whitman from 5 perspectives, and one of those is Whitman as pedagogue. I believe, and maybe my own proclivity as instructor here leads me to have more of this understanding than is warranted, but I believe that Whitman started out as a teacher at the age of 17, and I think he never stopped being a teacher. I think he saw his life's calling as an educator, a pedagogue, and to that degree, his pedagogy, or how he understands what good teaching is all about, especially because of his love of Socrates and the great Socratic method of asking questions. Notice, we're going to begin with questions here, we're going to end with questions here. Let's just enjoy the passage itself, and even though it's a longer passage, I want to read it in its entirety because, of course, it's such a famous passage. A child said, "What is the grass?" fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition out of hopeful green stuff woven. Or, I guess it's the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift, and remembrancer, designately dropped, bearing the owner's name some way in the corners that we may see and remark and say, whose? Or, I guess the grass is itself a child, the produced babe of the vegetation. Or I guess it's a uniform hieroglyphic, and it means sprouting alike in broad zones and narrow zones, growing among black folks as among white, Canuck, Tuckahoe, Congressman Cuff. I give them the same, I receive them the same. And now it seems to me the beautiful uncut hair of graves. Tenderly will I use you, curling grass. It may be you transpire from the breasts of young men. It may be if I had known them, I would have loved them. It may be you are from old people or from offspring taken soon out of their mother's laps. And here you are the mother's laps. This grass is very dark to be from the white heads of old mothers, darker than the colorless beards of old men, dark to come from under the faint red roofs of mouths. Oh, I perceive after all so many uttering tongues, and I perceive they do not come from the mouths, the roofs of mouths for nothing. I wish I could translate the hints about the dead young men and women, and the hints about the old men and mothers, and the offspring taken soon out of their laps. What do you think has become of the young and old men? And what do you think has become of the women and children? They are alive and well somewhere. The smallest sprout shows there is really no death. And if ever there was, it led forward life and does not wait at the end to arrest it, and ceased the moment life appeared. All goes onward and outward. Nothing collapses, and to die is different from what anyone supposed, and luckier. Now, of course, if you've been following our lectures early on, you know that we read out loud that line from the very end of passage 6 several times in our discussions of inscriptions, poems, as well as the sections, 19 sections starting from Pomenon. I want to begin, first of all, by just dedicating this lecture, and I'll do this periodically in our talks with Walt, but I will dedicate this lecture to my own 3 children, who each of them in turn were able, I think, to enjoy this set of lines early on as they were learning how to read. This was one of the ways that I taught them to read. It makes a lot of sense to teach children how to read using Leaves of Grass, and especially passage number 6. Let's first of all point out in the opening, very opening line, that we begin with a child. And so for our notes in 3a, we're going to do a lot of referencing here at 3a in this passage. It's almost as if Whitman knows that he is going to subsume the epic and the philosophic tradition from, of course, Plato, through Aristotle, all of the Greek dramatists, as well as, of course, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and then, of course, Virgil's Aeneid. Notice we begin with a child. Why is that important? Because you'll remember in Plato's Republic, in Book 7, the cave allegory, when the emancipator, the teacher, enters the cave to help out, notice where is it that he or she goes? It is, of course, to one of the young. Notice here it is a child, and notice the verb here is said, not asked. Isn't that interesting? The child said. It's almost like there is no answer already. It is translinguistic. Notice here, the child said, "What is the grass?" By the way, in the 1855, we don't have this italicized that we have in the deathbed edition, and then a few lines later with this word whose. Neither of those were italicized in the original 1855. I like that it's italicized. Whitman rarely uses italicized kinds of words in Leaves of Grass. What is the grass? Now, obviously, no question, this takes us back to our conversation very early on in the inscriptions section with In Cabin Ships at Sea. Why would we call Leaves of Grass Leaves of Grass? It is a strange title, and I'm relying heavily on scholars such as Harold Bloom to remind us how many different ways the title Leaves of Grass subsumes the epic tradition. In that lecture, you'll remember in Cabin Ships at Sea, if you haven't watched it, go back and look at it in detail. I actually read lines from Homer's Iliad, passage 6, lines 116 and following, that the leaves are very much falling to the earth, the way the life of a man is. Of course, from Virgil's Aeneid, passage 3, lines 445 and following, the leaves there can be brought together by Sibyl to give, of course, Aeneas the important information that's coming. From Dante's Inferno, of course, the idea of leaves from Canto 3, line 93, and then, of course, the leaves of Vallombrosa from Milton's Paradise Lost, from Book 1, lines 299. Of course, and I think this is central to our study of all of Leaves of Grass. I've said this many times, Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, those leaves that will be picked up to ignite a new fire somewhere in the future. And then, of course, there's the biblical referencing from Isaiah 40, verse 6, all flesh is as grass. So here we are now, at the heart already of why Leaves of Grass is called Leaves of Grass. And the child asks, what is the grass? Notice the verb, fetching it to me with full hands, and we're two hands again. In other words, the picture is a great one. Like, what is this bringing it to me? Notice the fallibilist epistemological answer, the fallibilist position, as opposed to the absolutist position, I'm right, you're wrong, or the relativist position, there is no truth whatsoever. Notice here it's, how could I answer the child. The pedagogic view of Whitman that will be understood powerfully in passage 46. You're asking me questions. I answer, I cannot answer. You must find out for yourself. And notice this, then musing is in some ways kind of a wondering about what is this thing, the grass, that's so amazing. There was ellipsis right after in the original 55 version. How can I answer the child now? There's nothing but a space. I do not know what it is any more than he. Now, I have said in my lectures at learnstrong.net on T.S. Eliot's four quartets that I am thoroughly convinced that Whitman was the most influential poet on Eliot to write four quartets. Of course, he would have denied that, but just think about this I do not know. And the opening lines from Burnt Norton, right? My words echo thus in your mind, but to what purpose I do not know, disturbing the dust on of whole leaves. Other echoes inhabit the garden, shall we follow? Quick, said the bird, find them, find them. I mean, I think that it's clear, this position of, I don't know, but I'm willing to take a stab at it. That fallibilist epistemological position is profound. I do not know what it is any more than he. In other words, a child, and this reminds us, of course, of that famous story in the Gospels when the children are brought to Christ, and Christ will say, this is what the kingdom of God is like. One of the, of course, most debated scenes of Christ's teachings. What exactly does this mean to be so childlike? Well, curious is obviously one way to think of it, right? Notice we continue now with this fallibilist guessing. Hints and guesses will be T.S. Eliot's rendering of this in Dry Salvages. Go and take a look at that last section in Dry Salvages. I promise you, if you read all of Leaves of Grass, and then you go into a close study of four quartets, you will be blown away by the ways in which Eliot was borrowing heavily from Leaves of Grass. Notice hints and guesses. Here it's I guess. I guess the grass must be the flag. We immediately think, of course, of drum taps and the sections we'll get to here and the flags that are part of the Civil War. I guess, he says, it must be a flag of my disposition, the way I feel, out of hopeful green stuff woven, and of course green, the color of hope, no question, right? Notice woven, and we've talked about how the Odyssey is the great epic of weaving, and so we've played that game as well. Or he says, I guess it's the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift. Remember the perfume of passage 2 of Song of Myself? And remembrancer, Whitman constantly, the only sin is to forget, this ability to try to remember, designately, intentionally dropped. Now, interestingly, he spells the word in this arcane spelling in the deathbed edition of D-R-O-P-T. But in the 1855, this is just spelled the normal way, D-R-O-P-P-E-D. Why would he play this game of arcane? It's fascinating. I think he's reaching back, maybe we would say. I guess it's, he says, the handkerchief of the Lord. The minute we think of handkerchief, of course, we think about Shakespeare's Othello and the way in which a handkerchief becomes the symbol of betrayal and misunderstandings. Epistemological, right, absolutism leads to all kinds of tragic death there, right? Bearing the owner's name some way in the corners that we may see and remark and say, and now we have italicized again, not in the 55, but surely in the deathbed edition, whose? Now, I think this is fascinating. In the old days, one of the ways that women could flirt with men at a dance was to drop a scented handkerchief to the floor and float to the floor. It's picked up by the would-be suitor, and the would-be suitor will then see in the corner the initials of the young lady, who maybe then can be given the handkerchief back. This is, of course, what Whitman is referencing as well. It's a wonderful one more way that Whitman can join an image to another image in such powerful ways. The Lord is dropping us a handkerchief. The Lord is flirting with us through the grass. It is, of course, very Emersonian. Emerson loves to play games like this where God is kind of playing with us. And, of course, Thoreau will echo the same ideas in Walden. Or, back to more guessing, right? I guess the grass is itself a child, the produced babe of the vegetation. In the 55 edition, there was an ellipsis after the word child, and here just the comma. That is to say that the grass is a symbol, if you will, or it is itself a child, the produced babe of the vegetation. What a great way to say it. In other words, children are like grass in that they come and then they grow, and then of course they grow old, and this will come back here now in a bit. Or, he says, I guess it is a uniform hieroglyphic. Now, This, by the way, is the fourth guess, if you're keeping count, right? Now, like Emerson, Whitman was very interested in the new information coming back in findings regarding Egyptology. He was fascinated by the whole thing. There was a lot of spiritual and religious research that was being done about these Egyptians and what they had to say through their hieroglyphics. Notice the use of the term hieroglyphic is as well useful for Whitman because it speaks to that idea of the game as he will reference it. Now we're going to see all kinds of echoes that start to play out from passage 5 now into passage 6. And what are these hieroglyphics? What does it mean? Everything has meaning. Notice it is a uniform hieroglyphic. Everything is harmonic and unified. Then we've got sprouting alike, obviously the grass, it's everywhere. Inclusivity, in broad zones, narrow zones, it's ubiquitous, we might say. Growing among, and now we'll reference black folks as among white, that is to say again, Whitman's inclusivity. He will mention in a second cuff, which can also mean a person of color, or it can mean someone of lesser standing, but certainly it's not necessarily a pejorative term all the time. Notice his inclusivity here, right? Then he says, growing among black folks is among white. Canuck is, of course, French-Canadian. Tuckahoe is an interesting word. It comes from the Tidewater Virginian who eats tuckahoe, this brown fungus, sometimes called Virginian truffle. Congressman is interesting that it gets put right in the middle between tuckahoe and cuff, right? In other words, Whitman says grass is very democratic. You'll remember from our passage 10 of starting from Paumanok, he said it, that the three great essentials are love, democracy, and the greatness of religion. And of course here it's the emphasis of democracy, right? It's the quintessential symbol for Whitman. That is to say, the grass is everywhere. It's ubiquitous. I give them the same, I receive them the same. This is Whitman and his attempts of equality. It's profound that this is where he's headed. And then, of course, some will argue the next line is the best single line of all of Leaves of Grass. And now, it seems to me, notice we've gone from guessing to seeming, the epistemological fallibilism of Whitman. It seems to me the beautiful, uncut hair of graves. Now, in some ways, you can run down a whole lot of Leaves of Grass as musings on death. And by the end of Leaves of Grass, with Farewell My Fancy, we are, of course, dealing specifically with Whitman in his kind of coming to terms with his own death. Notice the genius of this idea. We live, we die, and we are placed in the earth. Dust thou art, to dust returnest. That is to say, the lines of Longfellow's Psalm of Life. Then the echoes will start with passage 5. And I want to point out the brilliance of the way this is done. Whereas in passage 5 it was gently, now it's tenderly will I use you. Curling grass, Song of Myself, starting from Paumanok, passage 16. Do you remember that reference to the buffalo eating the curly grass? Here we're back to that kind of echo. It may be, notice now it's gone from guessing to seeming to now it may be 3 times anaphoria. The lines now will happen one right after the other with the same lines. It may be you, the grass, transpire from the breasts of young men. Now go back to passage 5 and take a look at that recognition of where the head is, first athwart the hips, and then, of course, the tongue and the breasts, right, area, the breast region. It may be, if I had known them, the young men, I would have loved them. We immediately think of passage 5. It may be, now he's speaking specifically to the grass again, you are from old people. We're going to get to old mothers in a second. Or, in the 55 edition, it was and from women and, but or from offspring taken soon out of their mother's laps, the children, right? And here, the irony of all ironies, you are the mother's laps. So it's a brilliant way to think about it. Notice in passage 5 we were talking about heads on hips. Here it's laps. Again, I just want to point out this echoing that we commented on early on. You're going to see this all the way through Leaves of Grass where Whitman plays these games. Then he becomes very immediate. This grass, notice how he uses this phrase, this grass is very dark to be from the white heads of old mothers. Now the great Harold Bloom argued this is one of the greatest American lines of them all. If you want to talk about what makes American poetry, here it is. Notice the power of the monosyllabic, right? All of these words monosyllabic, with the exception of mothers, which obviously emphasizes it. Okay? Notice the immediacy of a line like this. Darker than the colorless beards of old men. When we hear this dark all of a sudden, we're starting to think about Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And of course that grove scene, which is compelling considering our study with Whitman here. By the way, did you notice beards are mentioned? And of course we had beards in passage 5, didn't we? Again, the echoing is just brilliant. Only now it's the beards of old men. They're colorless because of course they're so white they lack any kind of color. Dark to come from under the faint red roofs of mouths. And here we are back with mouths and with tongues in the next line. And of course we're immediately thinking about passage 1 and the issue of my tongue. And of course mouths. O is the next word and reminds us of starting from Paumanok passage 19 and all of those O's. There's a certain kind of power in the use of the word O as he uses it. O, I perceive, and perception is everything we're going to talk about obviously throughout Leaves of Grass. The goal is, as it was for Socrates, perspicacity, insight, right? I understand things I didn't know before. Oh, I perceive after all so many uttering tongues. In the original 1855, by the way, there was an exclamation mark at the end of this, which makes some sense if you go back and study passage 19 of starting from Paumanok. The use of the word tongues is critical in all of Leaves of Grass, always looking to try to speak what is, of course, translinguistic. And he continues, I perceive they do not come from the roofs of mouths for nothing. There is value in everything, if only one can gain that kind of perspicacity that will allow for it. I wish, now notice, see how the genius of this poem, it's gone from guessing to seeming to it may be to now I guess, right, as we finish this. He says it this way. He says, I wish I could translate the hints